If you're a high-achieving woman who's exhausted by stress, stuck in constant conflict, and tired of being overlooked in the exact rooms where you know you were born to lead, then this podcast is for you. So here's your host, Pallavi Jain.
Welcome, my friends. We are now several months into this journey together, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge something. You know, the questions you've been sending me lately have shifted. Earlier, many of the questions were about personal stress, overwhelm, self doubt. I still get those, but now also what I'm hearing more and more is this: how do I lead others better? How do I handle my team? How do I show up as a stronger leader under pressure? And that tells me something powerful. It tells me that you're not just doing the inner work anymore, you're stepping into leadership with it. So, first, thank you for your trust, your honesty, and for allowing me to be part of that journey. And if you're new here, welcome to our Boss Brain. This is where we learn how to activate our boss brain, our ability to be on self start. We do that through the lead from within philosophy and the ATM framework. Arrive in the moment, take responsibility, make a conscious choice. And now today's episode is another Q&A, but with a slightly different lens. We're moving from just managing ourselves under stress to leading others under pressure without losing ourselves in the process. Because here's the truth: leadership doesn't break in big moments, it breaks in small, unregulated moments that happen every single day. A conversation you avoid, a reaction you don't pause, a tone you carry from one meeting into the next. And over time, those moments define your leadership. So today, let's explore some of the questions you've sent through that lens. But before we jump into that first question, let me give you a quick scenario, okay? Imagine this: you're in a meeting with your team. There's a deadline that was missed again. You're frustrated, but you don't want to come across as too harsh. So you soften your tone. You hint at the issue. You say something like, let's try to be more proactive next time. The meeting ends. Nothing really changes. And now you're carrying two things: frustration with your team and frustration with yourself. Because somewhere inside, you know you didn't say what needed to be said. That right there is where leadership starts to slip. Not because you don't know what to do, but because in that moment you didn't access it. So let's talk about that. Let me take the first question. The first question I have here is, why do my team members not take ownership unless I keep pushing them? This is one of the most common leadership frustrations. And most leaders interpret it like this: my team lacks ownership. But here's a reframe for you: ownership is not just a team trait, it's a leadership environment. If people only act when pushed, it usually means, one of these three things. Either the expectations are not clearly owned, consequences are not consistently reinforced, or the leader's energy itself is fluctuating under pressure. And that last one is important because your team is not just responding to your words, they are responding to your consistency. So if one day you follow up strongly and the next day you let things slide, you are unintentionally training your team. Ownership is optional. Now, here's the deeper layer we often miss. When you are leading from inner alignment, from clarity, not frustration, from intention, not reaction, the way you hold accountability changes. Then it becomes no longer about, pushing people. It becomes clear because you are clear within yourself. It becomes empathetic because you're not triggered in the moment. And it becomes firm because you're not negotiating with discomfort. You know when to hold the line, and you also know when to give grace. And that balance is not a technique. It comes from your inner state, comes from your internal state. Because when you are misaligned internally, you would either avoid the conversation, right? Many of us do that, or you overcorrect and come in too strong. But when you are grounded, you don't swing between those two extremes. We do that with our kids too, right? So you communicate expectations clearly, you follow through consistently, and your teams start to feel that stability. And that's when accountability shifts from something you enforce to something your team begins to own. Now, this is where ATM becomes practical. to really remind us what really needs to be done in those moments. So, first step A, you arrive. Notice what you're feeling in those moments. Is it frustration? Is it avoidance? Then you do T, take responsibility. Ask yourself, where am I being unclear or inconsistent in my leadership? And then you take the third step, M, make a conscious choice. Have the direct conversation clearly, calmly, and without over explaining. Because accountability is not about pressure, it's about clarity, consistency, and internal alignment. Does that make sense? Well, send me a note and tell me if that helps. Let's go to question number 2 here. How do I hold people accountable without feeling like I'm being too harsh? We've been there, right? Well, this is where many thoughtful leaders get stuck because genuinely they care about relationships. They want to be fair. They don't want to come across as aggressive. So, what happens? They soften the message, they delay the conversation, or they over explain to make the other person feel comfortable. What we were just talking about, right? But here's the truth, you don't need to be harsh to hold people accountable. You need to be internally stable. Because when you're grounded in that moment, or I should say, when you're not grounded in that moment, you get triggered by what you perceive as incompetence. You would react to the emotion, not the issue. And the conversation either becomes sharper than intended or more diluted than needed. And neither of those creates accountability. Let me give you a simple example. So, let's say a team member misses a deadline. Now, if you're triggered in that moment, the conversation might sound like, why does this keep happening? We've discussed this before, right? Now the focus has shifted to frustration. But when you are grounded, you respond differently. You might say, oh, I noticed the deadline was missed. Help me understand what got in the way. Same situation, but very different energy. One creates defensiveness, the other creates ownership. One is about, blaming somebody, and the other is grounded in curiosity. So the real shift is this: move from reacting to behavior to understanding the root cause behind it. Ask yourself, is this a clarity issue? Is this a capability issue? Do I have the wrong person and the wrong place, right? A motivation issue or an ownership gap. When you are internally stable, you can actually see the difference, and that changes how you respond. And here's the second shift that strong leaders make: they don't just hold people accountable, they build self leadership within their teams. Because when your team members are themselves clear on what matters, they feel ownership of their work and they are aligned with their own internal standards. Then performance stops being something you constantly manage. It becomes something they drive. So invest in self leadership for your teams. You will be surprised to see the shift that happens when your team is internally aligned and self driven. Then accountability is no longer about did you do this or not. It becomes how are you showing up as an owner of your role? And it's empowering. All right. Now, from that, let's come to our next question. And I hope this is helping you. I'm trying to give you some examples along with, the questions that I'm receiving. So, question number 3 is this is another important one and the one where we are in it a lot more than we would want to. So, the question is, why do conflicts in my team drain me so much? I can feel it, right? Can you? So, because you're not just managing the conflict, you're absorbing it. You're absorbing the tension, absorbing the conflict, absorbing the energy that's happening right there. And this is where neuroscience matters. When conflict shows up, your brain often perceives it as a threat, which means your nervous system activates, your perception becomes biased, it becomes clouded, right? Your brain is again doing what it does best, it is in this prediction machine, and you may start then assuming intent, reacting to tone instead of content, carrying emotional residue from one interaction to another. And by the time the conversation ends, you are mentally and emotionally exhausted. But here's the shift: conflict is not what drains you. Your internal response to conflict is what drains you. So, in those moments, let's apply the ATM again. Arrive. Pause even for a few seconds to ground yourself, not get swept away with emotion. Take responsibility. What am I making this mean right now? Right? What story am I telling myself? And then make a conscious choice. Respond to the situation, the facts in front of you, not your assumptions, not your memory, not your interpretation of it. And that one distinction changes everything. Try this in your next conflict and share with me if that made a difference. Now let's jump to our next question. Okay, I know what to do as a leader, but in the moment, I don't do it. Why? This is the heart of leadership. And if I'm honest, this is where even experienced leaders get it wrong. Let me give you another example. You receive a short email from a senior stakeholder, okay? No context, just a few lines. It says something like, let's revisit this, not aligned with expectations. And immediately, what would happen when you get an email like that? Your mind starts filling in the gaps. Oh my God, this isn't good. They're not happy. This is going to escalate, right? And now you're in a meeting 20 minutes later with your team. You're sharper than usual. You're more defensive, maybe even slightly reactive with your team. You start questioning decisions. You start pushing harder or even overcorrecting direction. But here's the reality nothing has actually happened yet. You've reacted to an interpretation. And later, when you get more context, you realize it actually wasn't as serious as you thought. That moment right there is the gap between knowing and doing. Because intellectually, you know, pause, don't assume, get clarity. But still, in the moment of pressure, you didn't do that. Why? Because leadership is not a knowledge problem, it is a state problem. When your brain perceives uncertainty or threat, it tries to close the gap quickly. It creates stories. It prepares you to react, right? And in those reactions, feel justified in those moments. Your brain is taking over. It's in charge, not you. But they are not always accurate. So even though you know you should pause, you move faster than your awareness. That's autopilot. And autopilot is driven by past experiences, emotional memory, data that your mind and your body has been storing for years, and the need for certainty to be in control. But your pause brain works differently. It creates space between what happens and how you respond. And that space is where better leadership decisions are made. So, in the moment, the shift is simple, but not easy. Arrive, pause, even if it's 10 seconds, interrupt the reaction. Take responsibility. What am I assuming right now? Make a conscious choice. Get clarity before you act, because not every thought is a fact. And not every reaction is the right response. And the more you practice this, the less you lead from assumption and the more you lead from clarity. You have to interrupt that automatic cycle that happens under pressure and change the control back from your brain and your inner system driving it to you being on the driver's seat, you owning what really matters and what am I really going to do in this moment. That's where shift happens, and that is what true leadership is. All right, let's take one last question for today. Let me see. I have a few of them. Okay, since we have talked about this, let's take this question. How do I develop self-leadership in my team, not just myself? This is a very important and powerful question. Because at some point, right, leadership is no longer just about how you show up. It is important, but it's not enough. Because it becomes about what are you normalizing in your team? Because your team doesn't learn self leadership from what you say. They first of all learn it from how you respond under pressure, how you handle mistakes, how you make decisions, and what you consistently reinforce. So the first step is not training your team, it's modeling what this actually looks like. Correct? Now, when you pause instead of reacting, when you take ownership instead of blame, when you make clear, grounded decisions and you become curious rather than assigning blame, you're setting a new standard without announcing it. And now the second layer is where most leaders miss the opportunity. They solve the problems for their team instead of building thinking within their team. So instead of giving answers, stepping in quickly, taking control when things feel off, start asking better questions. Ask them like, what do you think is the real issue here? What ownership look like in this situation? What are you choosing to do next? You're shifting them from execution to awareness and ownership. And over time, something changes. They stop waiting for direction and they start thinking like owners. That's when leadership starts to scale. And this is where lead from within becomes essential, not optional. This is where you introduce and teach them self leadership like you have learned. How you have activated your boss brain, it's time to activate theirs. Because ownership don't transform when one leader performs well. They transform when self leadership becomes part of how people operate, which is the leadership advantage in an AI driven world. Well, I hope that helped. I really enjoyed these set of questions. We have a few more questions here, but we can take it in our next episode. But what I'm really thinking is that this really reflected something deeper for me, that you're not just asking me anymore, how do I feel better? You're asking, how do I lead better? And honestly, that shift matters. But here's what I want you to take with you today, okay? Leadership doesn't break in strategy. It breaks in moments of pressure. When a mind is rushed, when emotions are activated, and your patterns take over. We're always in this rushed, overstimulated environment these days, and we're all in these moments of pressure, which can show up in so many different ways. Back to back meetings, performance expectations, there are home responsibilities, gazillion things, and emails, and social media, and so much information that's around us. So it's easy to be in these moments of pressure. And these are where the leadership breaks down. And in those moments, then you don't rise to your intentions, you fall to your internal wiring. And that is why leadership is not just about what you know, it's about who you are when it matters the most. And that is exactly why we learn to lead from within. Arrive in the moment, take responsibility, make a conscious choice. This is how we activate our boss brain. And over time, leadership stops feeling like something you try to do and starts becoming who you are. And when that shift happens consistently, it doesn't just change you, it changes how your team shows up, thinks, and performs. It changes your relationships, your personal life, the people around you. So if this episode resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone in your team or your network who might need it. And as always, please keep your questions coming. I read them, I reflect on them, and many of them shape conversations just like this. And remember that the most powerful leadership shift doesn't happen outside of you. It happens the moment you decide to lead from within. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.
So that's it for today's episode of her Boss Brain podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you listen and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 private VIP day with Pallavi herself. Be sure to head on over to herbossbrainpodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Pallavi's gift and join us next time.